and welcome to the Indus Report. Today we are going to take a look at a battle played beyond the battlefield and inside the mind spaces of two powerful civilizations on the globe. They call it fifth generation warfare, hybrid warfare, etc. But for a layman, it is a war of strategies, played by both the parties and to the extent beyond the common man's understanding. Let's take a look today at a strategic warfare between India and China. Before we begin, a quick message to all of you. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. It is because of your support that this podcast has been growing. And I am elated to announce that this podcast is now up on every major podcasting platform on the internet. So now you can search for this podcast on the platform of your choice. And don't forget to follow this podcast on any platform. It's free. Share it with your friends if you like the content. You can also share your viewpoints, opinions, or suggestions on the content by voice messaging. The link for this is in the podcast description. Today we have with us India's biggest expert on China, Shri Jaydev Ranade. Jaydev ji is the president of the Center for China Analysis and Strategy, and he is a seasoned China analyst with over 40 years of expertise on the field. He has been a cabinet level secretary for the Office of the National Security Advisor of India, and he is also an ex R&AW officer. Sir, my heartiest namaskar to you, and thank you for lending us your precious time for helping us understand this puzzle, which is known as China. Before, uh, before starting, I would like to understand how do Chinese people think, because when it comes to understanding the conflict, we must first understand how the enemy thinks. So we know how do Pakistanis think because we share a similar culture. We also know how do Nepalese people think. But when it comes to understanding Chinese people's mindset, it remains in somewhat obscurity from the general public as well as from the government. Is it a correct statement to make, sir?
Yes, it is correct. The Chinese civilization and the Chinese way of thinking are quite different from ours. Though we all call ourselves Asian civilizations and countries situated in Asia, actually in the Chinese mind, Asia ends where their boundary ends. And it goes on, of course, beyond to Japan, etc. So their concept of Asia is different. But let me come to your point about the Chinese mind. When we look at China as Indian strategists or even as Indians, what we need to look at really is the mindset of the Chinese Communist Party. There are 92 million members now today serving, many more retired. But what is their mindset? Because each one of them has a stake in the survival of the Chinese Communist Party and in the party retaining its monopoly on power. At the top of the heap is the leader, the president or the general secretary of the party, which is the most important post. And today, for I would say the third time in Chinese recent history, after the creation of the People's Republic of China, we have a very powerful leader as the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, the chairman of the Central Military Commission, and the president of China. China's three top posts all rolled into the persona of one man. The earlier leaders would have been Mao Zedong, who of course whose power was unparalleled. I would suggest even more than the present leader Xi Jinping's, and then Deng Xiaoping. But Deng Xiaoping had to compromise along the way because he had other powerful leaders also at the same time. Leaders who had been part of the Long March, who had been with him, and who also not only merited, but exercised their say in state policy. Xi Jinping has positioned himself probably as the sole person after having eliminated all opposition. So I will focus a bit on Xi Jinping, where I would just say that apart from being a powerful man, as you said quite correctly, his mindset is important. How does he think? What is his mental build-up, if I may say? He is a person who was born to privilege. His father was one of the comrades of Mao Zedong. He has been purged, or rather, his father, Xu Chongshun, was purged at least on three occasions. So Xi Jinping suffered along with them. The purge in China means you're deprived of your office, your position, your accommodation, all your perks and privileges, and you're sent off somewhere else to the countryside or to a jail. Usually, your house being made a jail. But you were denied any visitors, you were denied any outside contact. So he has been through that. He is seen during the Cultural Revolution, when his father was still purged, Shi Chongshun was still purged. He has seen his mother being humiliated, his elder sister being killed, and he himself being vilified. And then he was sent off to the countryside to work in a cave in a pigsty, which of course story is well known. So despite all this, Xi Jinping, unlike his classmates, former classmates, and unlike other children of privileged parents or VIP communist leaders, he chose to join the Communist Party. The others all left. Either they left China and went abroad, or they joined state-owned enterprises. But he chose to join the Chinese Communist Party and rise through the ranks. To my mind, this indicates the mentality of a very tough-minded leader, a person who is committed, and he also had this commitment to making China great again. This is something which, at the risk of digressing a little bit, let me say, this is something that is taught and instilled into the minds of the young students in the special Chinese schools, which only take in children of senior communist leaders. So they're actually creating a new generation of committed people. Xi Jinping is one of them, and his commitment is steadfast. We are seeing it. He's pulling out old policies from, I would say, the communist toolkit and applying them. Today, he has put China on a path where he is trying to also build up successor generations of committed communists who want to make China great again. So when other countries, particularly the US and West, look at China as an adversary, they need to look at this aspect also. So it's going to be, in case the US and the West still try and prevent China's rise or stop China's rise or try and dismantle the Chinese Communist Party, they have to contend with this leader and with this kind of a system.
Okay, so what are you saying is that Xi Jinping has consolidated power way more brutally than his predecessors did.
To some extent, he has ruthlessly eliminated opposition and consolidated his own position. He has also concentrated power in himself. So today he heads 18 central leading small groups, which are the most powerful bodies in the Chinese Communist Party, looking at various aspects of the state, including the military, economy, etc. So he is certainly the most powerful. But as I said, the mental makeup of the leader is also, in my mind, a very important factor.
Yes, definitely, sir. In the context of the recent border skirmishes with China, like we had in Doklam or in Nakula, in Arunachal Pradesh or in Ladakh, do you think we should look at these things in a standalone manner as a reason of this expansionism of China, or is it a part of a greater Chinese strategy? Because I heard and read somewhere that there is this Chinese strategy of encouraging border tensions with India, so that all the military allocation of funds goes to the army in the border areas. And in this meantime, China can buy more time for its naval presence in the Indian Ocean. So how much of a possibility you see in this statement being true?
It is a contributory factor. I think China's main objective is much larger. China sees us as a rival, or at most a potential rival, and it does not want to see us rise. So we look at various actions taken by China. Firstly, their bid to prevent us from getting into the United Nations Security Council as a permanent member. The moment that happens, we will become a rival of China's. We'll become on the same level as China. It does not want that. Second, it is trying to prevent us from rising and acquiring a high international profile, which is already happening. And that is another factor why China wants to put us down. A number of other things come into play here, which is why we see China spreading its influence in our neighborhood. So in sum, let me just say that as far as China is concerned, they want to keep India under sustained military, diplomatic, and economic pressure, and now, of course, even environmental pressure, so that we are bogged down and are preoccupied with domestic concerns and we are unable to rise. Thereby, China will be the sole power in the Indo-Pacific region. That is its ambition. I would say that getting us to divert our funds to the army is a very small contributory factor, more so because it may work to China's detriment in case we become aggressive. It's unlikely, but still it is there. So I would say that it's part of a larger Chinese strategy to suppress us and become the sole power in the Indo-Pacific region.
Okay, and sir, adjoining to the same question, as we talked about a little bit about the naval presence of China, sir, would you explain for the benefit of our audience about the string of pearls? It is a term associated with small dots of ports in the Indian Ocean taken control directly by the Chinese. So what exactly are the Chinese motives behind doing such things? Is it to encircle India from all the sides, or is it purely a commercial endeavor? What do you think?
I would look at the string of pearls. You know, the phrase string of pearls was coined by an analyst who was working in Booz Hamilton, which is a consultancy in the United States. It's a very sexy sounding phrase, and so it has got currency around the world. But actually, when we look at it, what does it imply? It implies a sort of series of ports at various strategic locations which are under Chinese control in the sense of China's domination. But does China really exercise control over these ports is the basic question. It has made investments, substantial financial investments, and it is developing at least 72 ports around the world, including in the Arctic region, in Europe, along the Indian Ocean littoral, and so it has got this network which it is building. It will still take a few years before it really develops them. But the basic question to be asked is, will the countries that host these ports allow China to carry out naval aggression or naval offensive operations from those ports against another country? So in the case of China-India, would they allow China to mount offensive operations against us? For example, a port in Bangladesh or a port in Sri Lanka, I think would be quite hesitant before they allow this. Of course, the alternate is that China can get them into a situation like a debt trap and thereby take over the port itself, like Hambantota in Sri Lanka, like Gwadar in Pakistan. I purposely did not mention Pakistan because Pakistan is a hostile country. And there, of course, that confluence of power, military power and economic power is something that we must factor in. The Pakistanis are fast becoming vassals of China and a place where Chinese power flows into. So I'm not touched that, but I have spoken about Bangladesh, spoken about Myanmar, spoken about Sri Lanka. These are the ports near us. The string of pearls will be only effective if China is permitted to launch offensive operations from there. The first sign of their intent is the port in Djibouti. Of course, the Americans also have one. The French also have installations right there. But they have a post in Djibouti, they position Marines there. And when we look at their larger plans to build a navy of 350 ships by 230, 240, then the picture becomes a bit alarming. we also expect within the next 5 years or so to see a Chinese aircraft carrier floating around in the Indian Ocean on almost a permanent basis. So we should not dismiss China's efforts to build a navy as something that is going to take too long in the future. It is happening now. They already have a permanent presence in the Indian Ocean, as you know, off the Gulf of Aden. So I would say that the string of pearls, I would not look at it as something that is going to actually tighten a noose around India, because we have alternatives, but certainly as a development that we need to build our forces against. And that is why I have been suggesting that we need to build up the Andamans and we need to build up Lakshadweep, two God-given features that we need to develop as outposts to counter and choke any Chinese naval attempts into our areas.
Yes, sir. Adjoining to the first question, so you mentioned about how China uh, pushes us, or how it makes us hard to negotiate with it. So the question is, how hard actually is it to negotiate with China on a military level, on a diplomatic level, or on a strategic level too? How is India going to counter this string of pearls strategy of China?
We have two aspects which we have already started. One is Sagarmala. The other is, of course, that we are building up our own relationships with various countries and trying to, acquire, shall I say, build agreements with them so that our naval ships can visit and, utilize those ports. We already have good relations with Mauritius. We are acquiring something in Reunion. We are working with the Seychelles to develop something. So we already have these, and with the Maldives. So we have these. We've also started building up the Andamans, which, as you know, sits at a very strategic location and can function as a choke point to prevent Chinese ships from coming in if we so desire. And I think it is time we start building Lakshadweep. Apart from those, our own capability in missile development will also be a factor that will come into play. So we have a number of areas by which we can counter Chinese naval power. The other aspect of yours about how easy is it to negotiate. Negotiations with the Chinese are very difficult, whether it's diplomatic, whether it's military. They are always very protracted. The outcomes are always sort of left ambiguous. And so far, I would say that most countries have not really come out on top in their negotiations with the Chinese. For the simple reason, as the Chinese say, 100 years is only the blink of an eye. So they are willing to wait if the others can. And that is why I advocate that we need to be very, very cautious about how we go with the Chinese, because A, we cannot trust them in their negotiations, as we have just seen. Secondly, they go by the Chinese text of an agreement. We go by an English text. There are differences between the two.
Yeah, definitely. And another thing is, I heard about the news that India is building a, a port in Iran, the Chabahar port. When the news came that Chinese are going to invest in Gwadar, that is in Pakistan. So, what is the situation in Iran right now? Are we still in that port building business there, or is it halted right now?
No, we are building that port. We still have an interest there. We still are trying to push it through. That port will actually give us a strategic link up into Afghanistan, and it will allow us to put pressure, if required, on Pakistan from that direction. So that is the strategic intent of that port. The second is, of course, Gwadar is a factor, but we already have Bombay. And as I said, if we develop Lakshadweep, then Gwadar will be an additional feature with which to block Gwadar. But now with the latest moves by the new U.S. administration, the Biden administration, to talk to Iran and try and reach some kind of an agreement, I think that will facilitate the faster development of Chabahar and ease the pressures on Iran, which will be to our advantage.
Okay, so a different question from this strategy and all thing. What exactly happened recently in Arunachal Pradesh with news floating about a Chinese town built up over a period of couple of months from scratch, and then a lot of news articles popped up. Some may be true or may be false. We received clarification from the government that they built this so-called village inside their territory, which is close to the border. As an Indian, what I need to know what exactly is the situation. So can you just shed light on what exactly is happening in Arunachal Pradesh?
Well, actually, it is not just Arunachal Pradesh. In 2017, the Chinese President Xi Jinping replied to a letter written to him by two sisters in a village called Yume on the Chinese side in Ningxia province, which is across Arunachal Pradesh, telling him about how they are living in such a remote area. And he wrote back in his letter praising them for being there and saying that he will ensure that the place is developed and they should be the guardians of China's frontiers, etc., etc. It is from then that Xi Jinping approved a plan, or he developed and approved a plan of what are called model well-off border defense villages, Xiaokhang villages. He linked that with the poverty alleviation program of China. And of course, the unstated but definite agenda of that was to ensure that the frontiers remained populated and they would become like watchtowers of the Chinese state on the borders. So there are plans till today of 684 so-called border defense villages all along the borders between China and India, and possibly some coming up across the Central Asian republics. I'm not sure of that. But along the borders with us, there are plans for 684 border defense villages. What we saw, some have already been constructed, about 74 or 75 of them. But what came into the news recently, which you are referring to, is the one near Kibitu in Arunachal Pradesh, in the Longju area, which is a disputed area. We had a post there. It was overrun by the Chinese way back in the 1950s, I think. And then it has been a kind of a gray area, but Chinese have built this village there. And which side it is on, if we go by the very ambiguously worded, but I would say, a bit of sophistry, the comment that it's a matter of, perception of difference in perception on the borders, which is personally speaking a very wrong statement, because we know where our borders are, the Chinese know where their borders are. So I think that statement itself should not be used. But this village has come up there. And the point to note for all of us is that this is going to be the first of many other villages. And since they are positioned at such a place, of course, they will act as, frontier posts, but the Chinese are also populating them. So where in Yume village, for example, there were two girls who had written to him, and the Yume village comprised of two of them and their old father. Now there are 20 households which have been settled there. Houses have been built for them, paved roads and a metal road connecting to the main road or to a main village, a main township, and internet and telephone connections. So this is what their plans are for all the 684 border defense villages. And the idea is to populate them. They're also trying to strengthen their hold on Tibet by mixing the populations. So people who live in North Tibet will be brought there. different, may not be all Tibetan Buddhists, maybe some Tibetan Muslims or some others, so that the cohesion of the Tibetan Buddhists is broken and the Chinese control on Tibet gets strengthened. So there are multiple objectives of these border defense villages, but certainly there are plans. They've already started building them, and the plans are for 684 of them.
Do you think that such news floating inside Indian media cast a negative image of India's strategic role and that of India's intelligence in the public? Because this is not the first time happening. We had seen this when we had border skirmishes in Ladakh also. So, do you think that this casts a negative image of India in the public's eyes?
You mean about building of the border defense
Uh,
villages
yes,
or?
building of the villages, but in the headlines it came that these villages were built inside of the Indian territory, and the Chinese occupied those territories and then built villages. Such type of news was floating, and this is what
Well,
not
I
this is
mean,
not the first time. So it has happened twice.
it's not technically correct. As I told you, that this was an area which was overrun by them and it is disputed. So they've taken it over. The point is, it was not under our control. So I think we are making statements that are diplomatically worded. But the plans were approved in 2017, as I said. So they were not a secret. I personally have written a very detailed paper on these plans. So it should not have been a secret. It was not a secret. I mean, it was out there. And I'm sure others also looked at it. But the question is, how are we going to respond to them? And it's not a question of lack of intelligence. It is a question of lack of a response. What do we plan in response, and do we plan anything in response? So that is what the government has to decide, what they're going to do. Do we have the funds for it? That is another factor.
Yes. So, what do you think about various Chinese projects all over the world, such as CPEC or the Belt and Road Initiative, and also various other Chinese investments in Africa? Are they doing any good for those particular countries where they're investing, or is it some sort of a carrot placed before those countries, or what is called as the Chinese debt trap?
Well, as I started in response to your first question, as I had said, the Chinese are looking at strategy. They have a grand plan for themselves, and putting India down, preventing India's rise is the first step in that strategy. By doing so, they will be the solitary power in the Indo-Pacific region. And their objective is to be on par with the United States, if not surpass the United States. They put a target date on it, which is 2049, the 100th year of the founding of the People's Republic of China. So that's what they want to do. But let us see whether they reach there or not. Obstacles have already come up. But as far as the Belt and Road Initiative is concerned, it is a $1.4 trillion project, as you know. And this actually is a way of China signaling that it feels confident enough to expand its power, military, economic, and diplomatic power around the globe. What it does is it links markets abroad with manufacturing centers in China over a China-built transportation artery. That is the commercial aspect of it. But there are other aspects. They've also now talked about the digital Silk Road. So they are setting up with their two champion IT companies, Huawei and ZTE. They're encouraging them to go and set up Wi-Fi communications, landline communications, etc., in countries that have signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative. And there, for example, at the port of Piraeus in Greece, certain people have found already an electronic center, a node, an intelligence center where they're eavesdropping on all the traffic that is going. So they're going to obviously do it elsewhere also. They're also now talking of a health road. In other words, creating health facilities along this road. So the road is actually symbolic of Chinese power across the world, and it is a rival to any other power that wants to be present. So, in a sense, it rivals the Americans. Now, reactions are different in different places. In Europe, we are seeing a division in Europe between the poorer European countries who want Chinese money to come in, who are willing to, in fact, many of them are taking, bribes, if I may call it, from the Chinese. They are wanting Chinese money to come in and sing a different tune from their other more developed European countries and partners. In Africa, the reactions are different. There is more acceptance of Chinese money coming in. Many people are saying without that, we would not have achieved anything at all. We would not have had any of the facilities that have come in. And so what if there is a big debt? So, each country has to call its own tune. In Sri Lanka, despite the very negative experience that they had with Hambantota port, now they're heading into the same situation with Colombo port. So each country has to call its own shots. Pakistan, Gwadar is going the same way as Hambantota into the Chinese hands. So they may do what they like. As far as we are concerned, we have to be watchful of how it impacts our interests. And I think there we have to gear ourselves up for tough times ahead.
Sir, don't you think that India must advocate for a transparency, more transparency in such Chinese initiatives like Belt and Road Initiative or China-Pakistan Economic Corridor? Because very limited amount of papers are available in the public domain regarding these projects. So this is what I heard from various sources. But is it so? And if it is, why is not India advocating for having more transparency on these investments of China?
Well, there are limits to how much noise India can make on this. But, we objected or we expressed our reservations to joining the Belt and Road Initiative on grounds of lack of transparency, lack of consultation, and lack of consensus. I think our stand was very clear and we have refused to attend any of their summits on BRI. The second was on CPEC, where we have other issues. We have issues of sovereignty and territory involved, which we have opposed. We also naturally brought out the fact that it was done suddenly between China and Pakistan without consulting us. So we have made our position very clear. And this rhetoric of a debt trap, which people are entering into by signing on to BRI, it was something that was started by us also. So I think we have made our position quite clear. And now it is up to others to either subscribe to it or counter it.
Okay. So another question would be, we recently heard about what has happened in Myanmar, the military coup d'etat and the imprisonment of the state councillor, Aung San Suu Kyi. Do you think this military takeover was powered by China? Is Burmese military acting as a Chinese proxy? If it is so, what should have been India's reaction to this coup?
Well, I'm unable to say at the moment whether the coup was planned and supported by the Chinese or not. But certainly it is interesting that the Chinese foreign minister visited Myanmar just some days before the coup, a week or so. The Chinese ministers don't normally go unless they have some kind of a discussion. And he met he met the Chinese military officers. I think he met Aung San Suu Kyi, I'm not sure. But he would certainly have been privy to what the plans were. There are differences in Myanmar also. In fact, Aung San Suu Kyi has sided with the Chinese of late. So I don't know whether they would have been that keen on removing her. But within the army, there are two clear groups. One which favors greater engagement with the Chinese, the other which wants a greater distance from the Chinese. So, that would have been a factor as far as China is concerned. But I think what India is doing that it has kept its lines of communication open with all parties and it's interacting with them is the best way forward. In fact, not only us, but including the others, like the US and other countries, need to come in, like Japan has done also, need to come in, make investments, and try and counter Chinese investments in that and influence by that, rather than just making a noise and opposing a coup.
And don't you think that India, which aspires to be seen as an emerging world leader, should positively interfere in the matters of its neighboring nations, even though it doesn't matter to it directly? Or it is not our stance from our very independence. We do not interfere with our neighboring nations whatsoever. So now that India aspires to be as an emerging world leader, should we positively interfere in neighboring nations or not? So what's your take on that?
I think interference in the internal affairs of any country, particularly a neighbor, is a double-edged kind of policy. It can backfire also, in which case it can backfire quite badly. But when our own interests are impacted, when our own security interests and sovereignty interests are hurt, then we will have to think of various options. And there are various methods by which it can be done. So I will just leave it at that. But I would say that, interference in the internal affairs of another country can leave very deep wounds. And so we have to be conscious of that as and when we do it.
And correcting to the above question, we recently saw Council of Ministers of CCP coming to Nepal and directly dictating terms to the Nepalis. So majority of our neighboring countries seem to have been more or less debt trapped by China. So Pakistan as a good example for this. And in the past, Sri Lanka, Maldives, now Nepal, Myanmar, and up to a certain level, even Bangladesh have been under Chinese influence. So what steps is India taking to ensure that the region remains under India's influence?
To put it very frankly, I don't think we can match the Chinese dollar for dollar. But we have other linkages with the countries that you mentioned. And I think basically, culturally, none of these countries is really going to mesh with China. I'll give you an example. Since you mentioned Nepal. Nepal has very close ties with India, very close cultural ties with India, linguistic ties with India. There are a lot of marriages that have taken place between the two. There are a lot of Nepalese who are staying in India, who are employed in India, who have bought properties in India. So where will they go? I don't see, frankly, them going to China and getting married there and getting, buying property, etc. There is no such system, and it will not happen. So where are they going to go? Ultimately, they're going to be here. The other factor is Nepal, all said and done, is a landlocked country. Twice it has happened that there have been pressure on them. Once when we imposed a blockade. The second time when they had their own troubles with the Madhesis, who slowed down the transportation of goods. And China as an alternative, I don't think will really work, because petrol, for example, and diesel is already more expensive in Tibet than in mainland China. Now, for them to transport it to Nepal is going to make it very costly, and they're not going to subsidize it. Similarly, passenger goods, etc., passengers and goods coming by train, it will cost a lot. Yes, today the Chinese have managed to make Nepal virtually dependent on them because of Chinese tourism coming in, Chinese money going in. But, Nepal also has to tread a fine line. So that is one. The second is money is not everything, as we saw in the Maldives, where the Chinese pumped a lot of money in, supported one leader who was hostile to us, got our projects cancelled. But then when the elections came along, another candidate came in who was not their candidate. So things can change. Same thing happened in Sri Lanka. Now, of course, their man has come back. So it's not a guarantee that their policies will be accepted in full. And I think as long as we can ensure that the policies adopted by those countries are not against us, we should be comfortable and try other methods of undermining and undercutting Chinese influence in those countries.
Definitely, sir. And there must be many fault lines within China, like uh, Tibet or Taiwan, for example. Is India taking advantage of any of them to mend Chinese towards India's interests? If yes, up to what extent? And if no, why so?
Well, the last question you have to ask the government of the day. But I think there are fault lines in China. We are all aware of what the fault lines are. Whether we can exploit them or not, or whether we do exploit them or not, is another issue. We certainly should keep plans ready. But again, as I said, if we do start attempting to exploit them, we have to be prepared for a pushback. And the point is, that is a what you call cost benefit analysis that we have to do, whether it is worth it or not. But we have certain levers which we should keep in a state of good repair.
Okay, and coming to the last question, we are in the last segment. So, how do you rate the current government on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of its commitment to the foreign policy and international relations? Do you think this government has been more assertive on a global scale than all other previous governments? And also, what are the shortcomings of the current government as far as the international relations are concerned, in your opinion?
Yes, I think this government has been more clear on what its foreign policy objectives are. They have tried to raise India's international profile and succeeded. They have taken a tough posture against repeated hostile actions by Pakistan. I think these are very positive signs and pluses in favor of this government. With China, I think my personal opinion is that the hype that was built up after every meeting could have been avoided. This particular situation that we are seeing, we would have been better prepared for. But in any case, I think the Prime Minister did reach out to the Chinese leadership on a number of occasions. It was not met with success. We have stood up to Chinese pressure, and I only hope that we continue to stand up, and this present development of last night about a limited disengagement at Pangong is not another attempt by the Chinese at deception and trying to catch us by surprise. We need to be very, very careful on that. But I would say that the government has done fairly well vis-a-vis the bigger countries, which are United States, China, the UK, France, Germany, and of course our immediate neighborhood. There is a popular refrain that look at our state of relations with our neighbors, they're not good, and people blame the government. I would not get into that debate, but I would certainly point to the fact that a bigger factor than what India could do or should have done is what the Chinese have done. So when we talk of the relations deteriorating or not being as good as earlier, it is not because of what India did or did not do. It is more because of what the Chinese are doing now, which they did not do earlier.
Okay, and as we are talking about the government, so do you think that by banning Chinese items or Chinese apps, we have done enough to counter China, or is there something extra we should look forward to, or that we must look forward to?
I think there's much more that we need to do. And the first thing is we need to reduce dependence in vital sectors on China or on a single source of supply. Everyone talks about the pharma, so let me mention that.
Yeah.
The pharma sector was independent for many years. And then because certain ingredients were cheaper in China to manufacture in China, they farmed it out to them, they outsourced it to them. Today we are in a situation that we have to be dependent on China for those supplies. That is something the government should have avoided. They should have stepped in and stopped it and said a certain percentage, enough to meet our emergency needs, should be done within India itself. Similarly, if you look at the power sector, most of our companies have bought Chinese equipment. Now, yes, Chinese equipment was supplied faster, they were cheaper, but what has happened? In the process, our own higher end technical capabilities, that is precision engineering, etc., have suffered. And we are unable to now, or we are not manufacturing those generators, which we could earlier. So these are areas where we need to preserve the capability that we had rather than losing them entirely. And let me end with mentioning to you something that I heard, quite shocking, where someone said that, you know, in India, we cannot produce a refrigerator indigenously. I was shocked. I said, we have so many engineers. He said, yes, but we can't produce a compressor. We could do it earlier, but now it's not taught in our engineering colleges because they're all imported. That is a sorry state of affairs.
Yes, definitely. So the gist of what you just said would be to make India Atmanirbhar is the key. Correct, sir?
Exactly.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for answering all of our questions very patiently and giving us your precious time. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.